Good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending on which part of the world you're joining us from. So again, to note to people that have just arrived that this meeting is being recorded, you should see a pop-up window now. If you press allow on it, it should disappear. Welcome to the first webinar in our research seminar series, part of the Transnational Cultural and Visual Studies research theme at the School of Modern Languages, Cardiff University, which is led by myself, my colleagues Nick Hodgin and Abdullah Gurni. So my name is Abdul. I am a lecturer here at Cardiff Uni in translation and editing, and I'll be chairing today's webinar. Just to give you a bit of background, since this is our first talk about the research theme, our aim is to try and bring together emerging and scholars with a shared interest in how cultures communicate across geographical, linguistic, and social borders. This year, we're excited to organize a number of webinars on a range of fields, including translation and interpreting, culture studies, critical theory, ideology and crisis, as well as adaptation and performance studies. We're very, very delighted to welcome our first speaker for the year, who is about non-translating and translation studies, a matter of convergence. So David is a lecturer in translation studies at Aston University here in the UK. He's also a research associate at the University of the Free State in South Africa. His research analyzes how translation technologies empower professional and non-professional translators, and how the democratization of technology allows translation users to become non-professional translators. He's interested in how non-professionalism impacts social translation, professional translation, and translator training. Before I hand over to David, I want to note a couple of things. So after David has spoken, we will open the floor to questions. However, as he is speaking, you can post questions at any time during the webinar by using the Q&A box, which should be below or at the bottom of your screen. You can upvote each other's questions, which will give us an indication about a question's popularity. If you prefer to ask your questions to David live after the end of his talk, you will need to use the raise hand feature, which is again at the bottom of the screen, but please do not use it during the talk. So you'll have to wait until the end when David finishes, and then you can raise your hand, and then we will unmute you, and then you'd be able to ask David your question live. So following the talk, there will be a very, very short survey, which you're all encouraged to take part in. It will help us a great deal in terms of planning our future events. So please, you're more than welcome to fill in this one. On this note, I'll hand over to David, who will take about 40 to 45 minutes to talk to us about non-professional subtitling, and that will be followed by the Q&A session. Thank you again, David, for joining us today. We are really, really delighted to have you. So the floor is yours. I'll stop sharing and then you can share yours.
Thank you. Let me see. I'm going to share my screen now. I think it's loading. Yeah, you should be able to see now. So thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation as well. It's a pleasure to this is a presentation of the year, so this is interesting to be part of this seminar in such a strange year. Thank you everyone for being here. I will be talking for a little bit more than 40 minutes, I think, and throughout the presentation I will include a series of polls. So if you have your phones, feel free to scan the QR code and start answering to this poll. Today, I will be talking about non-professional subtitling and translation studies, and I will be looking into the interrelation between translation, media, technology, and how this convergence affects translation in the broader sense, not just professional translation, but translation in general, and I will get to that in a moment. So if you're here with me, please scan the QR code and let me know what you think about convergence. I would like to start the presentation by basically learning a little bit about what you think when I say convergence, basically. In the session today, let me just go to the control panel. Here we are. Sorry, this is, as I said, my first presentation in Zoom. So, non-professional subtitling and translation studies, a matter of convergence. Basically, my work, I'm a professional translator, and I started looking at translation from different perspectives when I was doing my PhD, and I started working more and more into non-professional subtitling, trying to learn why non-professional subtitling happens, what are the benefits and what are the consequences of non-professional subtitling, but also how non-professional subtitling and professional subtitling interact in the current situation. In this presentation today, we will be talking about convergence and specifically non-professional subtitling, and then I will explain a little bit about my experience with reception studies and how I have been exploring, I think, sorry, can you see my screen? Oh, yes, yeah, that's fine.
Yeah.
Sorry. So I will present a little bit of my research, why I started studying reception and subtitles from the reception angle. Then I will move on from those results to talk about online communities in general and why I think translation studies need to look more and more seriously into piracy and the informal economy and translation in the informal economy. So let's just take a look at what you're seeing in terms of convergence. I see here people saying convergence is fusion, overlap, meeting, similarity, diversity. This is all very interesting, joining together, synergies. So this is very much in line with what we have actually. Convergence in the sense of media convergence and the context is mostly related to the work of Henry Jenkins. So the idea that there's a flow of content across multiple platforms. So let me organize my screens. Yeah, across multiple platforms that involves some degree of cooperation across different media industries. So the idea of convergence is this combination of efforts from different media industries distributed through different platforms, but there's also a more present and more powerful role of audiences, how audiences influence the media flow and how audiences act and operate in different platforms and somehow influence the decisions of other stakeholders in the system. And in terms of media convergence here, we're normally talking about the idea of media as a platform for entertainment. So the idea of Jenkins is a group of people influencing the flows of media and influencing the decisions. And this is a shift from traditional media where broadcasters and media producers basically made the decisions about what should be distributed, what should be created, and how content used to be circulated. In the sense of convergence, there's a shift from the producers as the ones controlling the flow of content to audiences and people and collectives operating and managing that flow, influencing that flow of content. And here, another term that becomes very relevant is the idea of the participatory culture. So the participatory culture understood as a culture in which there are some low barriers to artistic expression, where people can share and interact, where people teach each other and learn from each other by the interaction, where people do recognize that their contribution matters. So we have a bottom-up approach where the interaction of the people and the sharing of knowledge among those people in a given context, in this case media, it changes the way how knowledge and content is normally distributed. So the participatory culture influences this idea of convergence, and that's some of the ideas that you were mentioning, the ideas of fusion and synergies comes to this, the context in which audiences and producers start interacting more and influencing each other more. So we are no longer seeing these processes of consumption and production as something completely isolated, but as two processes that basically constantly influence each other, and a process where audiences actually have some additional power in the system. So here is where we move from the idea of convergence in general as a concept in media to the idea of translation and convergence. So what is the role of audiences in terms of translation? And then we start talking about fan subbing. So fan subbing is probably one of the most evident and visible and popular concepts of audiences interacting in translation. So people producing their own subtitles, people working collectively towards the production of their own subtitles. But before we move into that, I have another quick poll. So get your phones ready and let me know what you think about fan subbing. What two words do you normally associate with fan subbing? Okay, yeah, this is interesting. Anime fandom, yes. Okay, community reshaping, crowdsourcing. Anime is the biggest one. Creativity, that's interesting. Yeah, we will touch on these concepts. But here, it's very interesting to see that anime and fandom are one of the biggest ones. In translation studies, when we talk about fan subbing, we almost immediately think about fandom and anime. Both are concepts which are completely linked. And they are completely linked because the idea of fan subbing in translation studies has normally been this idea of a disruptive and creative practice that breaks away from what we would normally consider mainstream subtitling or professional subtitling. So fan subbing is interesting because it's daring. However, from fan subbing, when we move away from this idea of fan subbing as something that just exotic, as Tessa Doyer mentions, we see that there's a whole range of different actions of subtitles done by volunteers or non-professionals online who interact and organize themselves as, to work collectively for the production of subtitles. We do have those fan subs which are shiny and colorful and take a lot of place on the screen, but we also have something which I call professional amateur subtitles. Subtitles which try to reproduce, amateur subtitles that try to reproduce what they see in professional subtitling. So we have this whole range. And all of them can be considered non-professional subtitles that operate in a system, in an alternative system, an informal system, where people just organize themselves for different reasons and with different purposes. And it's important that we keep this in mind, because while fan subbing in terms of the colorful and impactful subtitles do call the attention of most people, there are other forms of non-professional subtitling that are also out there and do fulfill certain conditions. One of the reasons why I think there is a focus on fan subbing as something exotic and something daring and disruptive is because one of the foundation works that we have in fan subbing and non-professional subtitling studies is this paper by Norns, where he talks about abusive subtitling. And normally when we talk about abuse, we talk about abuse as something negative. And I think in many works in translational studies, that's the idea that we get, that abuse in abusive subtitling implies something negative towards the content. However, if we go back to what Norms was actually saying, was something completely different. Abuse for Norms was something relatively, or something positive. According to him, he says here, in the 1990s, we're witnessing the emergence of a new form of subtitling, which is by nature positively abusive. for norms, the abuse that happens in subtitling is not an abuse towards the content, but an abuse towards the corrupt practice of translation. He calls mainstream subtitling a corrupt practice because it tries to hide the foreign and the obscure nature of translation. It tries to hide translation. So for him, subtitles done by fans are abusive because they try to denounce translation. They try to make translation something evident. So we move from this idea of translation as something exotic in fan subs to translation as something that is visible and basically denounces itself as translation. So for him, the important part of fan subbing here is that it makes the foreign product foreign. It doesn't try to hide that foreignness, that otherness. It highlights that otherness. So when I started doing research on non-professional subtitling, and when I started looking into subtitles, I started to look, first of all, at the subtitles. I was very focused on the subtitles. But for me, it's been a process of learning that subtitles are just a piece in that bigger puzzle. And I think now I'm more interested in that bigger puzzle because from a translation studies perspective, I think it's fair and interesting if we look at the subtitles. But I think if we want to make translation studies more relevant, and if we want to talk about translation as a social practice with a communicational value at an international level, it's important that we start looking at that larger puzzle. And here is where I think we need to talk about convergence. If we look at fan subbing and non-professional subtitles as a matter of convergence, then we can look at that at the phenomenon as such and the implications that that phenomenon has for translation and for communication at an international level. So we need to look at translation as influenced and mediated by technology and as a piece in the media distribution network. So all these cogs working together here in order to fulfill a need or to serve a purpose in society. And in order to understand this, I decided to start looking at subtitles from the reception perspective. So how people use subtitles, how much people understand from subtitles, professional and unprofessional subtitles, and whether people have any preferences. So one of my first studies here was just asking translation students, this was done as an exercise in a class in Tarragona. I would just show translation students 2 sets of subtitles for a clip. We were watching the clip and they were choosing which subtitles they would prefer, which subtitle they would prefer for each specific scene. So I had a control group and an experiment group. As you can see here, the choices in orange are the choices for non-professional subtitles, and the choices in burgundy are for professional subtitles. I was very surprised by the results. Students were fairly largely inclined towards the non-professional subtitles as their first choice when they were choosing the subtitles. And in the interviews, or in the conversation in class rather, it transpired that they just felt that the non-professional subtitles were closer. And we will go back to this idea of the degree of connection and the assimilation of non-professional subtitling practices and the localization practices in non-professional subtitling later. But I think it's important here to just take into account that, or my takeaway from this first experiment was that for audiences, when they are just looking at the subtitles, they could be equally valid, and subtitles, they assess subtitles according to different preferences. This, we could agree on or disagree on whether people's opinions are more or less valuable, but from value we can say here, or I was convinced here, that for some people non-professional subtitles were valid, and in some contexts even better than the professional choices that were offered. From this study on choices, I moved on to a study on reception of subtitles. So I combined eye tracking, interviews, and questionnaires to see how people read non-professional subtitles, how people react to non-professional subtitles, and how much people understand from non-professional subtitles. So I was measuring whether non-professional subtitles would produce better or worse results than professional subtitles in terms of comprehension, and my results indicate that there was no significant difference between the set of professional subtitles I was using and at least one set of non-professional subtitles. I was using 2 different non-professional subtitle versions for this experiment, and one of them, the results for one of them for them was significantly different from the results for the professional set of subtitles, but the other one was equally valid, or it wasn't significantly different. So here I was looking at the actual responses, how much people understand from the content, and whether non-professional subtitles affect understanding at this level in terms of reception. And my results indicate that at least with some of them, there is no significant difference. But here it's also important to keep in mind that there are different types of non-professional subtitles. The variation in terms of subtitles as such, in terms of subtitling practices, is quite big. But my takeaway from this study was, okay, so non-professional subtitling communities, or at least some of them, do produce subtitles that are allow for comprehension, at least as good as professional subtitles. Then from those studies that were more targeted to Spanish population, I moved on to do a study on the languages involved in non-professional subtitling and the downloads, the access to non-professional subtitles. So together with a colleague, we did this study on the downloads of non-professional subtitles for the TV series House of Cards. This was in 2015, before the whole scandal with Kevin Spacey. And we did a study for the season 3 of House of Cards, and we were basically tracking the downloads of non-professional subtitles from the platform Edited. Edited is a non-professional subtitling platform primarily for US miniseries. So you find subtitles for many many TV series from the US. And so Edited is interesting because it doesn't just produce, the community doesn't just produce subtitles, but they also redistribute subtitles. So you find a multilingual platform with many different options. So it is the group of people creating subtitles for French is quite active, but they also redistribute subtitles in Spanish, Italian, Dutch. There's a big Portuguese community. They have Portuguese for Brazil and Portuguese for Portugal. So all these languages were involved. And we were primarily interested in whether people were eagerly waiting for the subtitles and how their behavior would change over time. So we tracked the downloads of subtitles for House of Cards between the 27th of February and the 13th of March. That's the first 2 weeks after the TV series was released. And we just wanted to see how often the subtitles were downloaded and in which patterns. So the first thing we found was that at the beginning, people were more interested in the subtitles. So people were eagerly waiting for the subtitles to be available, and they were using them downloading them quite fast after they became available, as you can see here in the first peak. And then the pattern starts to stabilize and become more stable. So the downloads just reduce and normalize. So this gives a very interesting view into non-professional subtitles, consumption as such, how people consume non-professional subtitles. But something that we found, or we were interested in, was which languages were involved in non-professional subtitles. So please go to Slido, and this is a multilingual platform. We were studying the downloads of subtitles for the TV series House of Cards, which is produced by Netflix and is originally in English. Which language do you think was the most popular in the platform? Which language do you think was the most interesting, the most downloaded from the platform? I would like to hear what you have to say. Okay, so most of you said that, okay, this is changing now. Spanish or English, English is growing. Okay, so yeah, I think it's very difficult for Spanish to overtake. So we can declare that Spanish is the winner, and for English to overtake, so we can declare that Spanish is the winner here. So the first thing we found was that on the platform in terms of languages, most of the downloads were for French. Then you can see here a huge difference between French and Spanish, Portuguese, Dutch, Russian, Italian, and Persian. These were the languages we found in 2015. And this, I think, we think could be explained because Edited plays a very essential role for non-professional subtitling in French, but there are many well-established communities in Spanish and Portuguese. So those languages are not that popular on this platform because it's just this one platform, it's not the whole community. However, we were very surprised to find that most of the downloads, but most by large, were downloads for subtitles in English. So these were intralingual subtitles in English for a TV series from the US. So you can see here that the differences are massive. We go from about 70,000 downloads for French to almost 400,000 for English. So about 80% of the downloads in this first data set for season 3 were for the English subtitles. Then we reran this experiment for seasons 5 and 6, and we saw a decrease. So the percentage of downloads for English was less in terms of proportions, but still quite high. I mean, we found that for seasons 5 and 6, there were more languages available, but English was still the most popular by far. So this also indicated to us that intralingual subtitles in non-professional subtitling platforms play an essential role, which is something that I think hasn't been discussed that much, and I think it's something that is worth looking into because it says a lot about what audiences are looking at and where people are looking at. We can also see a decrease in total downloads from season 3 to season 5, and this could be linked to the popularity of online platforms, and we will talk about Netflix in a moment. Apart from that, in terms of the patterns of downloads, we found a very similar pattern for both seasons 3 and season 6. At the beginning, there is a huge interest on the subtitles, and then this diminishes over time. And I think that is one of the peculiarities of non-professional subtitles. Immediacy is quite an important factor here. The fact that subtitles are ready quite quickly, quite fastly after they are released, after the products are originally released, is an essential element for non-professional subtitling communities. I think that plays a role in how they assess quality, for instance, and we will go back to the concept of quality and how different views on quality as well. So I moved here from studying audiences in terms of just approaching specific preferences to try to study audiences at a broader scale. And I think it's important here to consider that in any reception study, we are always limited by the number of participants we have and the preconceptions that we have, but we have other ways of accessing data, and we have other ways of assessing how people use subtitles and why people would use subtitles in a certain way or not. And I think here it's important to move on from the idea of reception studies to the idea of studies of audienceships, as this was a concept brought to translation studies by Luis Perez Gonzalez, and is the idea of audienceships as a context for the viewing process. we move away from the idea of audiences as a category of a person and move towards a situation that describes a specific set of practices and engagements with text and cultural materials. So we're not just studying subtitles as such, but we're studying subtitles in context, depending on a specific community and serving a specific purpose. And then here we start talking about translation as part of the international media flows and as part of this context of convergence again. And this approach to translation allows us to look at it as part of, as a tool in the international connectivity and the global distribution of content, because non-professional subtitling allows for this real materialization of an alternative media flow and democratizes access. We discover here that the role that fansubbers play in the international media flows is essential for allowing actual access in a digital world. It is not necessarily, it is not just about, it is not only a matter of availability, but also a matter of accessibility, how people can actually use this content. And in this regard, I think it's important that we start collaborating more and discussing more with researchers in Asian studies and researchers in media studies, who some of them, as Crisp here, for instance, do talk about the role that translation plays in this international media distribution. She states that probably the most significant contribution of these communities is the creation of fansubs, because that's what actually allows for the content to be accessible for the communities to share this content. So fansubbers become essential members of these online communities and become responsible for a lot of the interaction in these online communities. And we are now I'm going to ask you another question regarding these online communities. So how do you think, what percentage of contributors in online communities actually contribute to some extent to the community in terms of occasional contributors, not the heavy contributors, but what percentage of people involved in online communities actually contribute to the creation of content? You can scan the QR code here. I'll give you a second. Let me see. No, is it working? Oh, sorry. Oh, let me see. Okay, so most of you think that about 34% of the people involved in online communities are active contributors, or at least occasional contributors, or 25%. In reality, online communities operate more like this. So about 1% of the people involved in online communities are heavy contributors. They contribute, some people estimate, up to 90% of the content, and only 9% of people involved in online communities would be what they call intermittent contributors. So people who occasionally produce something that they make available to the rest. A lot of the people in these communities are simply lurkers or leechers, as some other theorists call them. They are just there to use the content. They are not there to produce content, but they are essential for these other people to think and to understand that their contribution is valuable. So that's how these communities operate. And that's why I think we in translational studies should start be looking more into this larger group of lurkers, people who are using translation to understand why they use translation, how they use translations, and what value they attach to translation in those contexts. So I think in that sense, it's important for us to understand that translation is part of that, is embedded in that, in the global media flows, both in official and informal channels, both in the formal and informal economy. And we need to look at those channels to actually understand how people interact with translation. Even more so in the current situation of media accessibility and media flows, because we have official players who are part of the mainstream media. We now have Netflix, for instance. Netflix is available in over 190 countries, and as of last week, I think it was available in over 30 languages. So Netflix is by far the largest player in media distribution at the moment, especially now under the given conditions with COVID. But it's important here to keep in mind that availability and accessibility are not necessarily the same thing. And then when we're saying that Netflix is available in over 190 countries, we're talking about different versions of Netflix, and this also applies to the internet. So the Netflix that we see here in the UK is very different from the Netflix that people have access to in Austria, and is very different from the Netflix that people have access to in Colombia, because licensing deals are different. And for instance, 5 years ago, when we were conducting this study with House of Cards, I remember that House of Cards, a Netflix production, wasn't available in Germany or Spain on Netflix because of licensing deals. So people have access to different versions of the internet depending on where they are, and they have access to different resources, even if they do have access to the internet. So this idea that the internet creates a playing field where we all have the same opportunities doesn't really align with the reality that people face. And that's why it's important to look at the formal and informal context in parallel in order to try to understand why in some societies informal practices have more value than in others, and probably have a place rather than formal practices. And my reasoning here is that formal and informal practices in subtitling and as part of the global media do have a place, and they interact in different ways. And they interact in different ways depending on contextual elements that will necessarily affect the way how they develop and the audiences they serve. So fansubs here allowed for this exchange of audiovisual content across regional demarcations and language barriers. That's the essential part with fansubs. They reinforce the possibilities of real international connectivity, because they create options for users to access a wider range of opportunities and materials as such. The thing is, in formal economies, the big players in the system decide what the rules of the system are. For instance, Netflix, in terms of subtitling, is probably going to become a standard international, because they operate at a massive scale, and many people look at Netflix as the example to follow. So we are in a situation where in informal economies, a lot of power is concentrated in just some players, and those informal settings actually gain more value, because otherwise those contexts in which those informal settings and those informal tools are essential will have different needs and won't have the same opportunities and resources as the formal and developed countries, for instance. So this coexistence of different alternatives create more options and more room for discussion and disagreement, which ultimately will lead to innovation and different solutions. And I think it's important that we keep that in mind, the idea that differences in the system will contribute to better and richer discussions about not just fansubbing and global media, but translation in general. And here it's important to emphasize that relation that hasn't been explored between translation and piracy, the role that piracy here understood as the increasingly digital practice of copying that fall outside the boundaries of copyright law as defined by Karaganis, and piracy as an essential tool in emerging economies and in informal economies, because it's important here to consider that even though we operate at a global level and media now operates at a global level, there are national realities that will essentially differ and that will expose the user to different circumstances. There's idea, again here, going back to what Abdel was saying at the beginning, the idea of borders. Even though we are not necessarily talking about politics, borders here have huge relevance and also implied massively, may have massive implications on people's everyday lives. In some contexts, like Colombia, for instance, piracy was essential for the democratization of access to media and entertainment. And to some extent, it became essential for people to have that access to piracy, because otherwise, for instance, I remember 15 years ago, 20 years ago, going to the cinema was still quite or going to a cinema or watching a new release was still quite social social demarcation. Some people just didn't have the money to go to a cinema, or in their hometowns there was no possibility to go to a cinema. For instance, DVDs and the illegal distribution of DVD copies basically affected, opened many opportunities for people in Colombia to access cinema. And here I also think it's important to open up the discussion of piracy, to talk about piracy in contexts different from these formal and legal systems of the West. Piracy as a tool in some spaces where it is essential for people to interact with that informal with that informal setting and those informal channels. Piracy could basically range, or we can understand piracy in a continuum going from just pure theft to free speech, and then there is constant discussion here of when can we condemn the actions of the pirate, and the idea of the redemption of the pirate when they do something in favor for activism or for social justice reasons. And I think it's important to kind of integrate that discussion to translation and to entertainment in general, because why we need to define, for instance, whether entertainment for the sake of entertainment and leisure, for instance, are a human right in the beginning, and how piracy does fulfill some of those needs. Something that we should take into account here as well is that when we move away from this discourse of piracy just as the loss of economical power, or piracy just in terms of figures, as we've seen, for instance, in March and April, there was something released in terms of the lost profit of the movie industry due to COVID and due to piracy. We also start looking at piracy as a driver for innovation and social change. Many of the platforms where videos and subtitles are distributed predate the official video on demand platforms, simply because when collectives are not bound by corporate purposes and are free to experiment, by definition, they will be more exposed to, or they would create room for innovation. This doesn't mean that innovation does not occur in the mainstream media and the formal channels, but there's also room for innovation in low-tech contexts, for instance, or innovation in contexts where the resources are not the same. So we need to understand the formal ecosystem, and I think it's important we recognize it, but we also need to understand the informal ecosystem and why people operate in the informal ecosystem and how ecosystems combine. And my idea is that this broader understanding of translation and understanding translation in comparison between the formal and the informal settings will necessarily open more interdisciplinary discussions that will help us find our place in society in terms of translation as translation studies and translation research, but also the translation profession. I think if we decide to explore non-professional subtitling specifically, but also translation in informal settings, we will be able to inform translation practice, translation research, and translation theory. And I think we will only benefit through this additional exploration. We shouldn't, I think, define translation only in terms of translation as a profession, because I think that will necessarily lead to a reductionist view of translation. While in terms of the changes that we're seeing now at a social level, I think translation needs to regain and probably clearly state its role as a social tool. And I think that's going to help us redefine the relevance of translation studies and translation as a human practice. By doing this at the same time, I think we will be able to revisit and question some of the concepts that we've seen in translation studies. For instance, the idea of the source text and the role of literal translation in society. Some of these non-professional subtitling communities tend to follow very literal translation approaches, and in some situations that might be the appropriate way because it responds to specific reasons that they have. We also see, I think, going back to the idea of the use of subtitles in English, interlingual subtitles, a wish or an interest in that original. So using intersemiotic translation as a way of approaching the original, using subtitles as a support for watching content in the original language. I think that indicates or suggests an interest among users to access that original version. Something that I think is going to be very relevant as well is issues of visibility. And this is not only about non-professional subtitling, but also machine translation as well. What happens when people have translation, so can access translation so easily, when they know where to go for the subtitles? We know that the people producing the subtitles and the people developing machine translation, for instance, know that translation is a difficult task. But what about the users that just need to log into, go to a specific website and they will find translation straight away? What's the impression that they get, and what do we gain from that visibility of translation? I wrote a paper recently also about quality and talking about some of the ideas that I mentioned before about immediacy and availability as elements of quality. I think we need to look at quality in this broader sense and open up the possibilities for the exploration of quality from different angles as well. And I think the approach to informal practices will also benefit that. And by doing this, I think we can easily enlarge translation studies to include global views of translation, to try to account for different roles of translation in society, not just in legal contexts. And inevitably, through this exploration, I think we'll be able to consolidate more the profession, because I think when we have this point of comparison, we will be more open to reinforce the value of professional translation as well. And that's it. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, David. Do you mind stop sharing your screen for a second?
No, I'll do that now. Yes.
Thank you. I'll share mine. So it's a virtual applause from all of us. Thank you, David. So it was a fascinating talk and an impressive range of data that you've managed to access, really, as one of my PhD students just wrote to us and said, The floor is open for questions. If anyone has a question for David, feel free. I can actually see a few questions in the Q&A box. So I'm going to read the first one. So thank you so much for an interesting and well-organized seminar. My questions are, how did you choose the NPS for your research? Any particular standards and caveats? Let's answer this one and then move on to the next.
Yes, so in my case, I was looking at, that's including in my PhD, I was looking at non-professional translation communities in Spanish that were organized as a community. So I was looking at subtitles that were produced by well-organized communities with I think at the time with a longish tradition, so more than 5 years operating. And I was also comparing non-professional translation communities translating into Spanish, but different variations of Spanish. So I had one from a community from Spain and a community from Latin America. I didn't assess the subtitles, and I decided consciously not to look at the subtitles because I was more interested in the reactions from the users.
Right, and thank you, David. And the second question, how did you figure out the 90-9-1 rule, or do you mind sharing the source of that rule?
Oh yeah, it's a Nielsen publication from 2006. It wasn't me. I think there are some variations of them as well. I think there's something related to the 80-22 rule. Yeah, 80-18-2, something like that. So there are variations, but in all of them, the amount of people who are just lurkers is quite impressive.
Right. So there is another question. Do you find non-professional subtitling somewhat threatening to the TS market in general? For example, in relation to the possibility of giving preference to non-paid work, and hence decreasing the overall quality of audiovisual translation that eventually reaches its audience?
I don't think so. I think that's precisely one of my points. I think we need to know more about why it happens, and we need to be able to establish that they operate in different contexts. I think if you're paying for a service, for instance, you will probably require some standards. So I've seen a lot of complaints of people, for instance, when it comes to poor subtitling on Amazon Prime or Netflix, because people are paying for a service, and depending on the context, audiences might be more or less reactionary. So I think that's precisely one of the points. I think we need to know more about the translation in informal settings in order to also bring more value to the formal settings and the advantages of paying for professional translations.
Thanks, David. And another question from Alexandra. Would you recommend producing NP subtitles as a way to practice to eventually start work as a professional translator?
Yes, absolutely. I think especially if you're working with many of the communities do have a system of mentorships. I think the TED community, for instance, is quite, they have a crowdsourcing approach to it, and they offer a lot of feedback to trainees, and I think they are interesting contexts. And I think the exposure to different requirements for subtitling and the possibility of receiving feedback will definitely help.
Right. Thanks, David. And another question from Joss. He says, thanks, David. There is a lot of effort going into the integration of machine translation into professional subtitling tools and workflows. Is something similar happening in fan-subbing networks?
Not that I know of. I think they are really good at using technologies in general, and I think they were ahead of many platforms actually, because they have been doing a lot of OCR and developing scripts and all that to accelerate the processes. But I don't think, I haven't come across communities that use machine translation. I don't think so.
Right, brilliant. Thanks, David, again. So another question from Mehmed. Fan subbing can be an effective tool for surmounting censorship. When it comes to big companies like Netflix, it seems that censorship is not an issue yet. With more and more production copyrighted by big companies and protected with high level of security, Do you think fan subbing would take new forms and adopt new strategies if such companies at some point decide to have resources to censorship, or sorry, recourse to censorship?
Well, I think it's a tool, and I think fan subbing plays that role in many contexts, and I think will continue playing that role because it's just the possibility of people to respond to that. Whether big companies like Netflix have or don't have censorship issues, I think it's relatively early to say, especially depending on languages. And I think more than in the cases of companies like Netflix, for instance, more than the actual translation is the availability of products in different areas or different contexts. And I was looking at something recently in terms of differences in subtitling between Catalan and Spanish, from an English original and subtitles in Catalan and Spanish, and there were differences in the subtitles, whether that something like that would account for censorship or not. I think that's a different thing. But I think there is I think we will learn more about that in the near future, and I think it's still a problem, and fan subbing will continue playing a role in that, yes.
Follow-up question on this, David. So do you have any data about, because obviously maybe there is no censorship on the content once it has been selected for being broadcast, but do you have any data, or do you know if there is censorship in terms of selecting titles or things to be kind of showcased on Netflix?
I wouldn't know. I don't. I would imagine that geopolitics would play a role, but I haven't looked into it.
Makes sense. Thank you, David. Right. Another question from Boye. I have a question. Is it really necessary to divide professional subtitling and non-professional subtitling? And is it possible to do so nowadays when many fan subbers also make revenues for maintaining their community if being paid is the only standard?
Let me check. I do think it makes a difference because the moment you are paid for your task, you are fulfilling a role for someone else. Whether fan subbers are making a profit, the moment fan subbers start making a profit, they become a company basically, which is something that happened with the Korean website. What's its name? It started as a fan subbing community, and then it moved on Viki that distributes a lot of Asian content. It became a company. So even though their subtitles are done by fans, or in general by fans, I would think that in my perspective, that would become part of the professional subtitling environment in a crowdsourced model, but still part of the professional subtitling.
Thanks, David. So another question from Joshua. To what extent do you think NP subtitling has been made necessary by commissioners, pro-subtitlers failure to identify the requirements of the audience? For example, additional cultural context.
Absolutely, I agree, and I think that was one of the main reasons for non-professional subtitling and fan subbing specifically to come to exist. But the reasons, since subtitling became easier and it became easier to distribute content, the reasons and motivations have become also more varied. So I think it's one of the reasons, but it's not the only one.
Thanks, David. Right. Another question from Bandar. How do you assess the visibility of fan subbing on social media? Is that what you mean by mainstream subtitling?
I don't fully understand, but that reminded me of the case of Evangelion last year. Evangelion was a Japanese series that was bought by Amazon and retranslated by Amazon. They created new subtitles, and there was huge uproar on social media about the retranslation because of censorship issues or denounced censorship issues. So I think that that creates another platform for the visibility of non-professional subtitling and fan subbing in general, but I don't know if that answers the question, Bandar, if you want to clarify.
Feel free to raise your hand, Bandar, if you'd like to speak live, or type in the chat box, whatever suits you best. I'll leave the question open until we'll see what happens there, and then I'll move on to Maria's question. So some practices of fan subbing have been adopted now by the industry. Do you think fan subbing will keep impacting professional practices, and in what ways?
Yeah, I think so, and I think it will work the other way around as well. I think also as something related to the question of training, I think as more people and more practices become visible, people will realize that audiences are more or less open to some strategies. And I think that will directly have an impact on professional and non-professional practices. I think they will constantly affect each other.
Brilliant. Thank you, David. Right. So another question, one curiosity, sorry, I think that was deleted. I'm not sure what happened, so I'll ask the next question. So one more practice, by Teresa, one more practice-oriented question. I often encounter the situation when somebody decides to rip my professional subtitles and upload them as their own to a fan sub page. Piracy and copyright rules aside, is this something that has been taken into consideration when assessing the student's preference of professional and non-professional subtitles? The sheer fact that the origin of set translation might be slightly obscure, or is it something that doesn't happen quite that often outside specific environments?
That specific study comparing professional and non-professional subtitles in class was done using subtitles that were created as part of these communities I assessed before. So I was sure that the subtitles were created by the community. Also, the subtitles were made available before the TV series was made available in Spain. That is to say, I did this study in 2013, but I was using videos from 2008. And I used subtitles that were available back in 2008 just to avoid that the case that they could be ripping the subtitles and then reusing them. When I was doing the study on Edited, for instance, I was more interested in people going to that website and downloading the subtitles. I were more focused on people actually using the platform rather than the subtitles as such, because the subtitles in English, for instance, are subtitles which are ripped from the content. They are OCR'd, and then that's how people create the subtitles. So there was no interlingual translation there. So I was just looking at the subtitles. But in the case of the preferences among students, I'm sure that the subtitles were created by the community. Let's see. So yeah, the origin of those was not obscure, or at least of that set of subtitles. Yeah, I think that answers the question.
Thank you, David. I think Bandar raised his hand, so I'll allow him to talk. Bandar, if you press on unmute, that would be great, and then you feel free to answer your question.
Okay, you hear me now?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, thank you, David, for this nice talk. I'm a PhD student at Cardiff University, and I'm working on studying fan subbing on social media, especially Twitter in Saudi Arabia. Okay. And I can say that this is a new form of fan subbing practice from a social practice perspective, as you mentioned. And I want just your thoughts on how this kind of new practice will influence other forms of fan subbing, like old-fashioned forms, how these fan subbers will be more visible than others because they're using social media to promote their content and post their subtitled clips directly on Twitter. And that means their capital, their visibility will increase with time. I think this is maybe an exceptional case in different countries, but what do you think about this new form of practice of fan subbing? That's my question.
Okay, no, super interesting. That's one of the things I always think about, that when we talk about fan subbing, we normally assume that fan subbing exists in comparison to an already established profession and solid profession, which is the case in the European context, where translation as a profession does have a history. But in some other countries, the figure of subtitler, for instance, doesn't exist because there is no local market. So in that context, social media and the internet become essential for people to make the translations more visible, and it will be in the interest of the fan subbers to make it more visible, and it will respond, I think, to specific needs of that society and that context. Whether that will lead to the professionalization of the field, that depends on the response of the market. And that's how I think, that's where I think it's important to look at the synergies between professional and non-professional contexts, and how mainstream media responds to that created need, or to that reaction from the audience.
Thanks, David. Another similar question from Karina. She said, thank you for a very interesting talk. Is there any research conducted on the fan subbers profile?
Yes, I did. Part of my master's dissertation, which is available online, was done on one of these communities, and there has been research on the communities. There is an ethnography study done by Dan Lee. I think Clara Yuan has also done some research on the communities. There are some studies on the Turkish non-professional subtitling community as well. So yes, there is research on the profile of people creating subtitles. I think May Volohan also did something on the motivations of fan subbers, of crowdsourced subtitlers in TED.
Thank you, David. Another question from Alina. Talk, a large source for obtaining subtitles are TED Talks. So TED Talks have been widely used to create parallel corpora for training MT systems. Would you consider TED Talks as a form of non-professional subtitling? And if yes, what would be the repercussions for MT systems for subtitling trained only on non-professional subtitles?
TED is a very interesting case because they do have a very well-regulated process. So one, they operate as a non-professional subtitling platform, and I think they do in terms of the crowdsourced system, they do control the process quite a bit. Their segmentation rules do not necessarily correlate with what we call for in professional subtitling, for instance, because they are more interested in the texture representation, and you also get that on their platform. So I think their translations are revised, and I wouldn't have many doubts about the quality of the translation at that level. At the same time, I think the original of a TED Talk is very well curated. There's a lot of work that goes into preparing a good text, a good original, and that naturally will influence the translation as well.
Thanks, David. Another question from Andrea. In countries where dubbing is prevalent, what is the impact of NP subtitling? Are there any studies about this?
Yes, and there are many. Non-professional subtitling has been quite essential in some of these countries. I think the work of Serenella Masida and Alice Casarini, for instance, in Italy, is a good starting point to learn about the situation in Italy, a traditionally dubbing country, where non-professional subtitling communities directly influenced the mainstream market as well. In Spain, I think the existence of non-professional subtitling also influenced, to a lesser extent than in Italy, the popularization of subtitles.
Thanks, David. So another question from Animan. One curiosity, what do you prefer to use, non-professional subtitling rather than amateur subtitling? Are the two terms interchangeable?
They are to some extent. I kind of married myself with the idea of with the term non-professional subtitling because it allows me to create this parallel with professional subtitling, and I've been following the idea of the lack or presence of monetary reward as the main definition between the two. But I think amateur subtitling or fan subbing would fit under the umbrella term of non-professional subtitling.
Thanks, David. Another question from Ayman. Thank you for the presentation. My research showed that Arab fan subbers self-censor themselves more often than professional translators who learn to be impartial and objective. How would you explain that in comparison to your research?
I think it's important to take into account that fan subbers are still members of the community. So they will try to create subtitles that respond to the needs of those communities. And one of that one of those responses, for instance, could be to provide an alternative to an uncensored version because it's more acceptable, more widely acceptable. So I think there's no straight answer, and I think it depends on the fan subbers as such. Acceptance and the perceived contribution of fan subbers is what fuels the movement. So they will, in general, I think fan subbers would create subtitles that will be acceptable by the wider audience.
Thanks, David. Another question from Savita, and I sincerely apologize if I'm mispronouncing any of the names. Thank you for a very interesting talk. I also have one question. Do you think that Netflix and other big VOD platforms reduce the popularity of fan subbing?
Yes, I think so. I think one of the reasons why we had less downloads of subtitles overall from Edited in 2017 and 2018 in comparison to 2015 was because Netflix was by then operating internationally. I think so.
Thank you, David. So a follow-up question from Boy. Follow up on my last question about dividing professional and non-professional subtitling. Politically activist subtitlers sometimes make subtitled videos as a campaign to raise funding for their political cause. Arguably, they are paid or they make revenue for their purpose. Do you consider them as professional subtitling or non-professional subtitling?
Let me, thank you for that. Let me just... But I think that's a whole different thing here. I don't think the relevant element here is whether they're paid or not, but that subtitles do have or fulfill this political function. I think that would be the primarily the main element to define what these subtitles are. And I think in terms of if you're studying translation and activism, that is the framework where you're placed. You're not the definition of the subtitles, the nature of the subtitles as such is not that relevant. I would say, at least from my perspective. I don't know if you want to complement something with a question.
Feel free to raise your hand if you would like to, and or even type your follow-up comment in the Q&A box. Until then, there is another question from, I think again, a follow-up question from Bandar. Why can we put social media fan subbing in the formal, informal ecosystem? Is it a mainstream subtitling? Is that a new concept?
No, I talk about mainstream subtitling as part of the mainstream media. Fan subbing would be part of the informal dimension of the system.
Brilliant. Thanks, David. And another question from Bronwyn. Where would I be able to find your dissertation online for fan subbing?
I can put the link on the chat. Is freely available. And
thanks, David.
The reception of non-professional subtitling is the title, but I'll just put the link now.
Thank you.
Okay, yeah, it's there in the chat.
Thanks, David. We haven't got any more questions, but if anyone would like to raise their hand or type a question, please feel free to do so. Until this happens, I was really fascinated by the concept of audienceship and your proposition to try to speak about audienceship instead of reception. And I wondered if you could elaborate a bit more about this. Do you have a definition for it? Have you kind of made a definition in your head or in your research about this?
Well, it's not my concept. I took it from Luis Perez Gonzalez, and then he took it from Lee. I think that's the concept. The idea is that audienceships would be defined by the situation in which they consume content. So the same person or the same audience, for instance, would take different roles depending on the different needs that they have at the moment. So is that possibility of understanding that subtitles and consumption in general will respond to different needs, and then we need to understand those needs and those situations to be able to understand the role that the translation and that the subtitled product plays in a given situation.
Brilliant. Thank you. And thank you for the readings as well. I'll certainly consult these. Right. So a question from Leandra. Can you elaborate on your concept of quality that you mentioned towards the end?
Okay, so that came out actually in an article from last year in Translation Spaces, in Translation Studies. I can put it in the chat as well. I think that quality in that sense is a multidimensional concept that needs to take into account not only the reception conditions, not only the production conditions as we normally do with professional translation, but also the reception conditions. So when we talk about quality from a professional translation perspective, we normally talk about controlling the process in order to provide a product that responds to a certain level of, to a certain standard, like the ISO standard or something like this. When we talk about quality as a social construct here, and when I try to look at quality in a more holistic view, I also look at that reception part, how people, under which conditions people or users access the translation, and how does the translation respond to the needs of those audiences. Because as I was saying in terms of immediacy, that concept, that availability of the product in the target culture shortly after it is released in the US becomes an essential concept to define quality in non-professional settings. So that's my idea, but you can check this article on holistic quality. It was published in Translation Spaces. No, Translation Spaces, no, Translation Studies last year. I'll include the link in the chat as well. Yeah.
Thank you, David. I'll wait for you to post the link and then, yeah, brilliant, thank you. So another question from Ayman. He says, any interesting research you would recommend on the influence of the translator's gender on the self-censorship of taboo language present in audiovisual production?
Oh, no, I don't know of anyone who's done that, but that sounds interesting, yeah. But I wouldn't know anyone who's done that, no.
There is one that I'm aware of. I'm not sure if it touches upon the core point. It was made at Salford University by Ahmed Al-Tahri, and actually he wrote about audiovisual translations into Arabic, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay.
He says Ayman says that this is his PhD research right now.
I think there was something on translation in Turkish communities in the non-professional subtitling book I edited, but I don't think they mentioned anything about gender. There was something about censorship for sure, but nothing. I don't think they mentioned anything about gender.
Thanks, David. Bandar, I see your hand is up. I'm going to allow you to talk again. So if
thank you. Yeah, thank you. Just a follow-up question on my idea of social media fan-subbing. Do you think that if we can present a new concept of fan-subbing as social media fan-subbing, as it is different from what we have seen from fan-subbing practice in other means, in terms of fan-subbers' visibility, interaction with audiences, their way of interaction with audience, their visibility? Can we speak about a new form of fan-subbing, and we call it social media fan-subbing, taking into account their dependence on social media to promote their content and interact with audiences? This is my first question. My second question about quality in non-professional subtitling and fan-subbing. How do you see the development of fan-subbing and subtitles, taking into account their harness of technologies and use of new ways to like learn and develop their skills, subtitling skills? Thank you, David.
So about social media, and thank you for the question. And the first part about social media and non-professional subtitling, I think it probably makes sense. And I think the rules for subtitling in social media are very different from the rules of professional subtitling. And I think even in mainstream subtitling, professional subtitling, that's something we should look into as well. So it would be interesting to see how it compares, because even in professional settings, the subtitles for social media are just radically different from what you would find on a film, because they just serve a different purpose. So I think it makes all sense. And the second part of the question, sorry, what was it about technology and training?
It was about quality. How do you see quality in within time in fan subbing practices? Is it like developed from like the beginning of fan subbing? Because fan subbing nowadays are using new technologies to learn and develop their skills.
Gotcha. Yeah. Well, the thing is that quality, it's impossible to say that fan subbing has good quality or bad quality as a default, because it will respond to many different factors, as I was saying before. Some communities, one of the elements that I found that benefits quality in terms of non-professional subtitling and fan subbing is well-structured communities that develop over time and come up with their own rules and regulations. So they have their own guidelines, they have internal training processes, they have mentorship systems. So they're actually very well structured. But there are other fan subs that are just created by individuals or people occasionally. So it's impossible to say that that fan subs would automatically be good or bad in terms of quality. But I think time and organization in these fan subbing communities tend to be one of the indicators of higher quality standards in fan subbing.
Thank you, David. Bandar, I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you.
Just a comment from Les Renowens, who's our colleague here at Cardiff. Thank you so much for a rich and stimulating paper and discussion. And a question from one of our PhD students, my PhD student, Jacob. So Marcela Di Marco has written a lot about the interrelation of gender and subtitling, though I do not recall if she has explored self-censorship. So it was a comment more than yeah, thank you, Jacob. So the Zeynep, the Turkish researcher, and yes, no reference, sorry, I'm missing the point here. No reference to gender as far as I can remember too. Thank you for this enriching presentation. I think that was all the questions that we have. So I'm gonna share my presentation, my screen again. Thank you so much, David. So another applause for me. That was really fascinating. And
thank you for organizing and for all the questions. That was really interesting as well.
We really loved having you with us, and hopefully we'll see you at Cardiff again soon. Oops. So just to remind our attendees that we have several talks coming up. The next one is by Professor Anthony Pym on how translations are really received, and it's on the 19th of November at 1:30 UK time. And the rest of the speakers are organized by the dates on which they are going to present. So feel free to join our, or just check our events page. Or if you can't find this, my email address is on the screen. So feel free to email me and I'll send you the details of any of the events that you would like us to send you. The one by Khitam Khalid Andia is in January. It has not been publicized yet, but it will be very, very soon. Thank you very much for being with us. And let me just check if there is another question here. No, that was everything. Well, thanks again, David. It has been a pleasure having you. And thanks for all the attendees for joining us today. And hopefully we will see you in one or more of our events in the near future. So enjoy the rest of your day, evening, morning, depending on where you are. And thanks again, David. And see you all soon in our future events.